Today is April 20th, 2011, and my name is MROHP. I am interviewing Mary Kay Blue, who was a member of the Longmont League of Women Voters from approximately the mid-1980s until about 2003. She was also elected state representative from Longmont in 1992 and was elected to the RTD board in 1996 and served until 2004. This interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program. The interview is being filmed by MROHP. Well, good to have you here, Mary. And my first question to you is to state your name and the date of your birth.
Mary Kay Blue, K for Catherine. I was born February 26th, 1938.
And where were you born?
I was born in Wichita, Kansas.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood and growing up. Were other members of your family involved in civic affairs that might have led you to the League of Women Voters?
I grew up actually in Loveland. My mother was born there in 1901. My parents moved to Kansas in the Depression for my dad's work. So all three of us were born there, but we came back to Colorado when I was 7, and I've almost lived entirely here in Colorado since that time. My dad was a practicing attorney in Loveland. He is a CU law graduate, so was very active in the Bar Association, and it was very common to talk about civic affairs and politics from pretty much a nonpartisan standpoint around our dinner table in the evening. My mother very much loved Colorado and Colorado history. My father's father owned the Loveland paper, the Reporter Herald, and came there in the 20s and owned it. I believe the family owned it until the 40s, late 40s. And so having a newspaper in town, knowing about Colorado history, knowing about what was going on with the nation and the state and locally was very important to us. And the only political activity in my family prior to my jumping in was that my dad served on the Loveland School Board in the 50s, and was schools and support for schools was very important to him.
And I believe you mentioned earlier that he went on to become a judge.
Yes, he was appointed to the bench in that judicial district, and I believe it's the 8th, but I'm not positive that the seat is Fort Collins. He was appointed by Governor John Love in the late 60s and served basically until his death in 1989, although he went on retired status earlier than that, and so it gave him the opportunity to go to serve on several benches, particularly around the Front Range, on a vacancy status. And so one regret of my life is that I never appeared in court to watch him in action, but he had I think a fine career and was commended several times for his judicial wisdom.
Wow, that was an incredible service to the state, serving all those years. That's quite a accolade for your family, certainly. Was your mother, I always ask this question, was your mother a member of the League of Women Voters?
She wasn't, but I don't recall that there was an active chapter in Loveland in those days. It's possible it came in later. In my adult life, I began as a college graduate teaching in Greeley, and then we were gone briefly for 2 years when my former husband was getting his doctorate back in Michigan. So, and excuse me, then we were back in Loveland, and then I was in Arvada in Jefferson County, and I knew about the league early on from that experience. I didn't participate in an active league group at that time because I had teenagers and I was pretty busy with some scouting programs. But it was after we moved to Longmont in 1979 I began to hear about it, and actually heard about it from a very close friend, and then became close personal friends of several members of the Longmont group.
So, sort of mutual friendship kind of drew you into the league.
That was right. And then, fortunately, I was able to meet some very quality women who were interested in general policy ideas, and I enjoyed their company, and I enjoyed the depth of the discussions, and got to know them where I might not have known them otherwise.
Could you, before we kind of go into maybe your own sort of political career as well as your civic career, could you tell me a little bit about the Longmont League that you encountered when you joined in the mid-'80s?
It was a group, I think we met once a month, and we met usually at noon, and we had a couple of Longmont restaurants where we would be given a sort of a private area to have our meetings. I remember them being pretty well shut off. I'm trying to think of the names right now. I'm not even sure if they're still in business. But so we had time to visit and have lunch and to discuss the issues that were coming to us from the state and the national headquarters. And they were always very timely. I was particularly interested in support for schools, for education, and in literacy. And I appreciated the way that, even though I have at time to time been a partisan person, I appreciated the League's outlook and approach being strictly nonpartisan. And I worked closely with people who were not maybe of the same political persuasion as I was, but we cared about the same issues.
So even within the League, you could really just work on issues that were just meant for building a good community.
Absolutely,
right.
And a regional outlook and statewide as well.
Now, can you remember what some of the issues were in the 1980s and into the 1990s that the Longmont League particularly addressed?
Education was one of them, and that was of prime concern to me. I think water quality was another one. Issues around the Trans Mountain diversion, because this is very important, particularly to the North Front Range, probably for others too. I recall my dad saying years ago, although he wasn't a water attorney, he said, trust me, water law in Colorado is going to be one of the most significant areas of law in the future, and it's certainly true even today. So knowing about how important water is to our economic benefit, to our families, and knowing where that water comes from and that it is quality water. I remember specifically the water issue. Although I got into transportation issues later, sort of at the end of my time on the League, I don't remember it being as close to the, well, as much in the forefront as water quality and things of that nature, but I think now transportation would be a big one.
I'm wondering, since you brought up water, there were a number of people on the state level of the League who worked very closely with the state government on water issues. Do you remember when you were a member in working for the quality of water, like what the particular approach was or what you were looking for in terms of, I don't know, whether it was related to sewage or to treatment of sewage or where the water was coming from?
At my recollection, it was more from the what is the basin of origin, the whole dynamic around Colorado River water originating here. Well, actually, Colorado is the home source of most of the major streams in the country when you think about it. And is that water being protected as it should be by us who are sort of its guardians where it begins? And then particularly with the Colorado River water, what happens on down the way? And it's still a big issue. I know Arizona and California enter into this all the time.
So this is more along the lines of more like an environmental overview rather than this is what Longmont needs in terms of its water.
It wasn't that specific to Longmont, but I know
Okay.
there's another individual in Longmont whose name I will give you for an interview who was more instrumental than I in making sure that Longmont had good water supply on into the future. And Longmont civic leadership prior to my living here, one of our mayors, actually Ralph Price, secured our holdings up around Button Rock, which is the source of some of our water to this day, and that was done early on. I'm still trying to get my handle on the whole thing about water rights and how historically those are secured and preserved, and that's why I think why my dad referred to the water court and water laws as being significant because it still is impacting all the Front Range cities.
Yes, now we have the whole issue around, is it Gross Reservoir up in the mountain there, and so.
And toward the north of us, I know even though we're in the same county as Boulder, we are more affected by the Poudre in some areas, and that we get some of our water. We are members in Longmont of the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. We, Fort Collins, I think maybe Boulder is also a member, and Loveland, there's 4 cities. And I was privileged when I was on city council to take the water tours. Some of them are local with the basins that like Horsetooth and those that are on the Front Range. Others go clear up to the Grand Lake area at the source of the water. And seeing it firsthand and hearing all the dynamic around it, it's made me, given me a much better understanding of all the particulars that you have to weigh when you're being judgmental about should this project be built or shouldn't it.
Going back to the League as an organization, how did the Longmont League structure itself and function and get new members and, you know, just sort of a general overview of how that group worked?
I don't recall that I was ever an officer, but I did attend pretty regularly in those years, and my recollection is that there was usually at least 1 or 2, maybe 3 topics that were suggested to the local leagues from the state, and certain members will either volunteer or were assigned to do research on those topics, and sometimes the state league would provide them, and other times we kind of did it on our own, and it was always a good learning experience. And I recall that we were pretty willing to share in those responsibilities. And just as in the water discussion, it might be an area where you individually didn't have a lot of expertise, but you certainly learned. And it was kind of like school at times, but I was never sorry that I had gone to the trouble to explore whatever it might be.
And basically the league has like 2 areas where they work, or 2, I don't know, sort of arms of the organization. One that is more involved with sort of advocacy, which might be on the water and education side. And then there is the side that a lot of the public associates the league with, and that is voting and education around issues and access to voting and, I don't know, forums for candidates. And I wonder if you had any experience with that
I did.
in Longmont.
I helped to set up forums, and we my recollection, I'm trying to sever my history of doing this as a volunteer for the League and also the times that I was a candidate. It was usually a collaboration. The League would help with the local newspaper, and sometimes the local Chamber of Commerce would be one of the partners. And of course you have to find a venue, and hopefully inexpensive, but hopefully one that had parking so as many people could come as possible. I think these are now televised by the local access channels, and so people even who can't attend can still view them, and those are usually shown several times. That dynamic did not exist when we first started doing this, and I think it's a valuable tool. And then I know as a candidate, I always look forward to those opportunities because I thought that the League, together with the other partners, did a fine job of setting the rules, giving everybody equal time, and I know that it is their practice to acknowledge issue discussion from time to time as well as candidates. And I'm very supportive of voter education, and particularly I think I don't know why it seems most important, but on the day that we're coming to now of the mail-in ballot, and who knows but what eventually we're all doing balloting online. I mean, I haven't heard that, but I suppose it could happen. The good job of educating is very, very important, and the League, I think, that's one of its big charges.
And do you have any stories to tell about perhaps where that made a difference? Where you really felt that your participation
I can remember
with that
personally being at
worked?
those events and handing out information to people, helping them figure out where particularly if they were new in town, how they made a contact with the county clerk so they could get registered to vote. I just had this incident happen in my own family recently. My daughter just moved from Longmont into Weld County, and one of the first things she said to me, this was about a month ago, was, how do I figure out where I vote? Because she's living in a rural residence. And so even though she is not a political person as such, I think I've transferred that desire to be an active participant to her, and she thinks that's important even though she knows we don't have anything on the ballot until November.
Well, that's great. It's there it goes to show you really intergenerational civic participation that goes through your family. Now, during the years that you were in the Longmont League, say roughly, the mid 80s until roughly 2003 or 4, while you were working with the League, did you notice any major changes for the League in Longmont as the city changed? Did the League also change?
I don't remember the city changing that much, except that it just became larger.
Okay, it became larger.
The population grew. I think I've over time felt that the public identifies the League as being a voter information source, which I think is very important. Having been, you mentioned earlier that I was elected to the state legislature, and I was just there one term. But, and of course it was a very partisan setting because you run as a partisan person. But then when I went on the RTD board later, it's there's no party designation for that ballot. And so I learned to work in a nonpartisan environment. And so, which of course the League is, and I appreciate the collaboration there and the opportunity for the League to reinforce the importance of judging issues from a nonpartisan standpoint, which we certainly did in our League discussions. And then I actually was elected to the city council here in Longmont in 2005. Served 6, 7, 8, and 9. And here again, it's a nonpartisan environment, or supposed to be. And I'm a kind of a stickler for partisan politics being appropriate where they are, the legislatures and Congress, and most municipalities not being partisan. There's no designation on the ballot. Most issues, I think, carry nonpartisan labeling, or should, and you get a better evaluation of the issue in a nonpartisan setting. And so the League is important for that reason. And so my recollection is that the League evolved in, accepting electronic media as a component, and the things that have happened in our society just as well as any other group, if not better.
Over those years, so, and other people that I've interviewed have mentioned that actually that the electronic use of, whatever, the internet and so forth was a great boon to communication within the League. So, I mean, some of them.
I really noticed this when I was serving, particularly in City Council, because that was very recent for me. And people would say, for example, oh, that must be awful, your phone ringing all the time, come fix my pothole or whatever it is. And I say, no, I really got very few phone calls during those 4 years. It was mostly email messages, which can be read at your leisure. And sometimes, and because of the electronic media, you can go to the source for getting answers to those questions, and the League is sometimes that source. If they're complaining about something or want more information, you can go to that before you respond to them. So I think candidates use those kinds of things quite well.
That's interesting that from sort of the person in the arena, sort of at least the political or the governance realm, actually could then use the League as a resource. So it's interesting to get your perspective sort of as a participant, and then being very welcoming to the League as a resource for people in government.
Was helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Could you give me an idea of like how big the Longmont League was?
Probably when I was a member, we probably had a dozen to 15 members at the most. I know there are people, and it varied, and it kind of did begin to go downhill. And I think as women have gone back to work, that's one of the dynamics. I've noticed that other organizations that I've belonged to who meet in the daytime, their numbers have dwindled during that same period of time. I'm thinking specifically of a couple of people that I knew during that time who had been much more active prior to the time that I joined, and they might have a different feeling about that. But it might have been larger then.
Okay, so what you observe, but anecdotally, not sort of statistically, is that women's involvement in the workforce does have an influence on women's volunteer activities.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know what time of day the League, Boulder County League, meets now, but I would guess that probably daytime is, you're either getting older members or you're meeting at night.
Right, and I think from what I've heard, the unit meetings are at different times,
Yes.
So they try to meet the needs, I think, of a variety
Right.
of people. So I'm very impressed that your league was able to accomplish that much with that number of people. So that's exciting. Can you remember when you were? You said when you were a member of the League in Longmont, you said you were not an officer, but you did work on education. Because it was so small, did people just meet as a whole on things, or did you have a lot of subcommittees, or did you lead a committee, or?
My recollection was that we might have had a small subgroup to do research on an idea or an issue, but that when it came time for a discussion and to reach a position that we wanted, especially to make public, that we did it with the whole group.
Okay, and then, of course, at the same time, you were doing the forums for
Yes.
debate and also getting all the information out about the election.
Right.
So that is
And we would
really
also,
quite a bit.
and this has even been, I'm looking back more recently, even when I was running for city council and I was no longer a league member. Obviously, they were the league was present at forums, but they were also present often at city festivals. Things we have festival on Main Street, which is a downtown issue. We have the Rhythm on the River, which is a midsummer thing at one of the local parks, and attracts a lot of people. And we would often have the league would often have information booths at those events.
So community
Get the word
presence.
out, exactly. Especially if it's an election year.
Well, anyway, looking also at the league here, in terms of how members worked according to a process, did this group also use the famous sort of consensus process?
Yes, we did.
Okay, so that, whether it's a small league or a big league, that process seems to work for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And what did you think of that process?
I don't recall that I had direct knowledge of the workings of that before I was part of the league, but I thought it worked fine. And it was always interesting when you try to, because when I was in the league, I was a fairly new resident within the first 5 years of living here, and sometimes you try to label somebody, oh, this person is way right or way left or whatever. And I found it interesting that in their discussions of different issues, that it was apparent that they most of the members pretty much judged each issue on its own merit. And so you couldn't necessarily pigeonhole somebody about their beliefs on one issue, because they might be much different on the next one and maybe more closely aligned with your own.
So sort of taking the best parts of how to govern well.
Exactly.
And how to build the community. Everybody looked at sort of the issue on its merits, and that's very interesting. And it led to a lack of stereotyping and openness towards each other. Were there any, over the years, sort of big disagreements within the league that separated people that you ever had experience with? Was there something that really people sort of put really on the back burner because you just couldn't deal with it?
About the only time that we postponed a discussion was if we hadn't had enough time to do the research. It comes sometimes, because we were a smaller group, the demands on individuals would be greater, and we just, for whatever reason, family or whatever, we felt we needed more information, and so then we would. But I don't recall there being anything that was that contentious.
Okay. And now speaking, say, of the Longmont community itself, you said you took part in community events. How did the Longmont City Council, other governing bodies receive sort of league observation or possible participation as members? Sort of asking sort of what the reputation of the league was.
What the reputation is.
Amongst, amongst city council or, the city in general and the staff, and what, if you had, like good relations and...
I think so. My association with the city was later, after I was no longer, after the Longmont branch was not that unit meeting, I guess it's called, was not that prevalent. So my recollection is that there was always respect, because I know whenever anything was being sponsored, particularly with a forum, the league was always included. Now, it may have been because certain members were upfront about making sure that the league was included, but I look back to some of the people that I worked with who went on to be leaders, and one of them is a former mayor, and She was very active in the league prior to my knowing her really well. So I'm sure she learned some of those good governing skills there, because it's a give and take and an arena where you want to learn as much as possible. So my impression looking back is that there was always a positive reputation of a group that could contribute well.
And I'm wondering too, since the Longmont League did undergo change and eventually has become part, after 2005, I believe, part of, and it became the League of Women Voters of Boulder County. Prior to that, say in the mid-'80s or on, did you ever note any particular, since you're both in the same county, any particular cooperation or relations with the Boulder League of Women Voters?
I don't recall anything specific, but I think that there probably was. If they, for example, if they were doing some research, that they would share materials, or if they were bringing in an expert speaker on a topic, that they would share that as a single event between the two.
Okay, and then and subsequently, as we both noted, the Longmont League has become, part of, or we can say that they've all merged and they're all part of, one large county group now, looking at issues in a broader sense and sort of including women that way. Your comments on the League as a women's organization. I know that since 1974 the League allowed men to join, but they don't have a majority presence, and probably a very small minority presence in the League. But so do you have any thoughts on the League as a women's organization for either helping women become more active citizens, or going into politics, or maybe in other ways that you've observed?
My reaction to that question is sort of mixed. My earliest recollection of the membership in the Longmont League was that there were no men, but then later I recall 2 or 3 different men that were members and that did participate. And I can't tell you currently if there are men from Longmont that are part of the county league. I personally, I don't mind their being there. I'm not a sexist, but I like having the advocacy of women. One of my favorite books of all time is Cokie Roberts' Our Founding Mothers, which I read with delight and will probably read again, and it goes clear back to the issue of suffrage. And I know that both Wyoming and Colorado were historically out in front on that, and it's important to me. And I often relate it to my own mother, because if she'd been born, I think 1 year later than she was, or 1 year earlier, she would not have been able to vote when she was 21. So I think that the issue around suffrage and I'm fondly a student of the women in the United States who almost put their lives on the line for suffrage, and that's very important. And I sort of identify the League with that cause.
Well, and it did actually
Yes.
come right out of
Right.
the National American Women's Suffrage Association with Carrie Chapman Catt. So yes, they have a splendid history behind them. And so you see it, in a sort of in a really a way for women to gain opportunity
I know
within the sort of political and civic
Right.
arenas.
And when I was serving in the legislature, that just those 2 years, the the minority leader in the House was a very fine woman from Boulder, actually, Ruth Wright, who I became very fond of. And if we'd had, I think it was 2 more votes, she would have been Speaker of the House. And so that has,
Wow.
I learned a lot from her. Let's put it that way.
Wow.
She went on to do some other things in Colorado that I think are significant. But having somebody like that as a mentor was important to me. And
she was your mentor in the legislature, but
legislature.
not actually, because she was a league member, so.
yeah, no, not so much from the league,
'cause
but
you
I'm
were-
sure she gained many of her skills from the league, having that. And she went on to do other things. We were talking about water earlier. She was on the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy Board for a long time. And though I was only there 2 years and didn't have the opportunity for leadership in that area, then when I went to the RTD board and kind of grew up in that organization, and then was asked to be chairman for 3 years, and I learned a lot of things. And I'm sure it all kind of fits together with maybe my early upbringing of being politically aware about what was going on, and then reinforced by the league and the importance of women sharing in governing responsibilities, which I still feel is very important.
So there's sort of you do see a sort of a direct connection between participation in the league and then moving on.
I do.
Would you like to talk a little bit more about your work in the sort of political arena and in the RTD?
When I went on the RTD board in 1997, my first year, my predecessor in this district, which is pretty much eastern Boulder County and Broomfield, had been there 14 years. And I'm sure he did a fine job. And I actually ran unopposed both times for both 4-year elections, which is not good democracy, but it's certainly less expensive. And it was my first venture into a nonpartisan role. And I frankly think, even though I'm fond of men and respect them in their governing roles, that women are better listeners. And I think the listening part of governing is equally important to the speaking, and helps you to build conciliation and consensus, and that's a quality I got from the league as well. So, and I mentioned earlier the fact that I think a nonpartisan environment is, I'm not going to say it's superior to the partisan environment, but sometimes you get a lot more done. I think we're finding this out true right now as both our state and our national legislative bodies are faced with these severe budget problems. We had budget problems at RTD, and RTD still has budget problems, but they weren't of the scope and the nature, and so it's tough. I don't criticize elected officials very often because I know how hard that is.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the experience of running for office, since I know that there have been a number of people like Ruth Carell ran for office, so that were in the league and fairly famous, and Ruth Wright, and now you're another one that will go down
had this in Longmont, and
in the annals.
I would mention our former mayor, Leona Stacker. She was in the Longmont League, and it may have even been when it was founded. I don't know, but you would have to check with her.
And she went into
And she
politics.
became mayor and she served before term limits went in, so she was mayor quite a while and was reelected every time she ran. And I think she did a good job. She's a personal friend. In fact, she's somebody I would recommend that you talk to because she has that league experience. I think it's a good training ground for anybody wanting to be in politics, if you will. Another part of city and county government that is very important, that isn't necessarily as demanding as being a candidate, is to serve on boards and commissions. And here again, I think the league always encouraged people, if they had a particular interest, to serve on those commissions. There's no pay, and sometimes it's long hours. And I was on the Boulder County Planning Board at one time.
Wow.
I think between my legislative career and that at RTD. But city government, county government just isn't going to work without those boards and commissions to do the thoughtful planning and the learning and the discussions. So all of those need active people who care and who have the time and who are willing to put in the time and be fair about it to be on those commissions.
Yeah, and for you being on those boards, does that mean, since I'm unfamiliar with this, so I'm going to prod you on this, does that mean that, again, that you're in that phase where you really have to educate yourself on whatever the issues that are coming up?
Absolutely. When I went to to run for the RTD board, I was defeated in my legislative race in 1994 when I was the incumbent. It was a gentleman who had been a mayor here, and he happened to be a neighbor of mine, so it was a very interesting election. But it was not a time to be a member of my party in this town, and that's just the fact. And we actually became very good, even closer friends after he was in the legislature and he was on the transportation committee and I was chairman of the RTD board. So we worked very closely together. But what got me into that was it was the mayor. She wasn't mayor then. Maybe she was. Leona Stacker came to me and said, "You've got to run for the RTD board because Longmont needs to be represented." This is prior to fast tracks and all of that, and I said, I wouldn't touch that one with a 10-foot pole. In those days, the board, for some reason, was composed of people that were more interested in the headlines and personal antics than they were about providing good transit for the regional area. So I kind of did it under protest, and then I didn't even have an opponent, and it was definitely a learning experience. I rode the bus occasionally, but I really didn't know much about bus transportation. And I wouldn't say I'm the best authority now, but I certainly know a lot more, and I'm a big advocate for fast tracks, and I still, which is still a topic of discussion. Mm-hmm. And you do learn to educate yourself, and you use whatever resource there is, whether it's the league. Sometimes people have asked me, what do you think about lobbyists? And here again, I have to go back to legislative days. What I learned in that respect is that the best lobbyists are that you learn to respect them and value their help, and they will be good educators. And if they're strong-arming you, then that's something that you don't want. But you learn to know, and you also learn which ones you can trust. So I know the league probably still has lobbyists, at least at the state and national level.
They do.
And another organization I belong to, a women's group, also has lobbyists at both levels. And those lobbyists that provide information in as fair a way as possible are the ones that the legislators will trust and will listen to. And you build that rapport with your individual lawmakers, and then it comes home to roost in a positive way for you.
You know, I just have to say very quickly, I hadn't realized when I thought about the league lobbying at the state level that once again they were really educating people just in the traditional league way, whether it's a voter or a legislator. They're trying to, get the facts out there and try to create, a better community. Or community that helps citizens. So.
And the approach that always worked for me, the one I valued, was when they would say, "Are you aware that?" And they said, "This is some information about this topic. Please come to me if you have further questions." Rather than, "You owe this because we supported your campaign." That doesn't go anywhere.
But of course, and as we know, one of the big issues, at least at the Boulder County League now, is the whole issue of term limits.
Yes.
Not term limits, but election campaign finance reform. Excuse me.
Yeah.
That is reforming elections. So campaign finance reform.
This even has come up in Longmont. It was a big item of discussion when I was sitting on city council, and it still is. And I think there was a recent ruling, a recent vote that had to do with that. Transparency in campaign financing is real important, and I think the league still supports that. You need to know what group is pushing whatever the issue may be.
Well, in just summarizing these different experiences that you've had, could you, I don't know, in a nutshell, talk about sort of the difference for you as an elected official, for the legislature, and then more city council and boards, and the latest one is disability transport is?
Well, I'm a board member now, currently in my 7th year, actually, of Special Transit.
Special Transit, okay.
Which is a nonprofit that provides transportation for anyone who can't drive. The majority of our clients are senior citizens, obviously, and some disabled folks. But anybody, an able-bodied person who loses his license, we have had folks like that. And it's been exciting to be in that organization. I was recruited actually because of my RTD experience, not that that transfers over that much, but I still am in my last year of service there, and then I also serve on the Longmont Area Visitors Association board, and those are the only 2 policy-making boards I'm involved with right now. But I think the league experience, I can recall a very close friend that I used to talk issues with. This is when I first moved to Longmont, and she and I became good friends. She was an active member of the league. She's no longer living, but she's the one that got me interested in the league, and I was never sorry that I had that experience. And I think, although my family especially was very surprised when I decided to declare for the legislature in 1990, because I'd never done anything like that before. And it was actually school funding that got me into it. But in the absence of that, and of course that's still an issue, and now even for higher ed, I think all those have meshed in my life, and I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to be of service, and I think the league experience probably made me a better public official. I hope so. So I've been told by people that I did a fair job, and now it's
and now they won't let you go.
And now it's retirement time.
They want you to just keep on serving because of your great experience. This is kind of more along the lines of maybe a little bit, I don't know, more philosophical, but we were talking that the league, really tries to improve democratic governance at every level, whether it's, very local, county, state, federal. And I was wondering if you had some ideas about, what the most important democratic practices were, that the league has supported in the past or they should support in the future, but, what makes for a vibrant democratic participation and a vibrant sort of working democracy.
That's kind of a tough one. I am always shocked when I see voter turnout, that it's not higher than it is, just because not voting, if I were in my deathbed, that would be about the only reason that I wouldn't be there. And my family's been that way too. Voting has been very important. And one of the privileges that I gained when I first ran for the legislature was going door to door. And some candidates still don't do that, and I still do. And the past election, I went door to door for others, not for myself. But you meet some really nice people there, and I've had people say, I wasn't that involved in making sure I was registered and going to vote until you talked to me at my doorstep about how important it was. And I still remember that, and they do too. And the league can play a very important part in that. How important, even though you may not be a policy decider yourself, your contribution is to make sure you are registered, that you are educated, and that you vote.
Wow, so the same refrain that the league has been singing since the early 20s.
I hope so.
Is still there, and the need is still overwhelming. And then, of course, today there's always the issues around access to voting
Yes.
as well. And I know the League has supported, I think, easier access for people to
Anything
vote.
that we can do to make it easier for folks to vote.
Vote, right. So, well, great. I'm not sure that because you've not been involved lately, but maybe you can also speculate on this one. What do you think some of the important goals or work of the League will be in the future? If you can sort of project them further into the 21st century,
Well,
what do you see as
Oh,
a
excuse
biggie?
me. I personally feel that environmental quality is very important, and so anything that the League can do in that regard would be one, and that would include, of course, water. And we live in a state where environmental concerns are very important to us, as they should be everywhere. Besides voter education and access, environmental quality, public support for education. I think those would be my three that I would care about.
And of course, you know, you can see because of the crises of today that
Yes.
all of those continue, even when the League created those priorities probably in the 50s and 60s in Boulder County.
I didn't personally, because
still
I never
important.
was a business owner, I didn't personally work with business organizations, but when I became a public official, I learned a lot about them, and I still feel that those partnerships are very important. And so anything that the League can do to promote the issues that they've traditionally promoted as being economic incentives for the populace are important as well. Water quality and education being too.
Right, right. And just across the board that no matter where you stand in a democratic society, there's certain issues that are part of the
That's
quality
right.
of life. So that's interesting also. I have another question, which I think you indirectly answered already, but within the Longmont League, were there particular women that were mentors to you? I think you mentioned the one mayor, right?
Mayor Leona Stacker was one. Mary Sook was my close friend who got me into it. Another person that was very active in the League for a long time was Maritza Snedden. And I've sort of lost touch with her, but I think she's still living here. I don't see her very often anymore. I remember that she knew what all the issues were, and she was on top of every suggestion that was coming down to our local league from the state and the national level, and looked at many things through those eyes. And I think of those three specifically.
And they brought enthusiasm to you
Absolutely.
and definitely drew you in and helped you. Did any of them work on your campaign?
Actually, Maritza did. In
Oh, my
fact,
goodness.
When I was leaving the RTD board, I encouraged her to run from Longmont because, as you know, it's a 4-city area. It's all of eastern Boulder County and Broomfield, and a little bit of Thornton actually. And she did run. She was not elected, but so that was the first time she'd been a candidate. I think she was a good candidate.
Well, it sounds like maybe there's some joint mentoring going on,
Yeah,
just
I hope
jointly encouraging everyone, people to get involved.
She was very helpful.
Right, right. I was wondering also as whether you had any anecdotes, personal stories about the League, the people that you've known that you'd like to share. As part of the lore of, I guess, the Longmont League.
I don't really have that I can recall. I just remember the whole thing being positive, and I particularly remember some individuals that were particularly active, and some of them unfortunately are deceased, but they were very helpful to helping me. They probably contributed to my maybe being a better public official, and they didn't know it at the time, but
which goes to show you that, you know, as we act in the world, you never know what
Right.
the impact is.
Right.
And so that's great. Well, I'm really finished with all the questions that I have, and I'm wondering if there's anything that you'd like to address at this point.
I think we've covered it pretty well. I'm sorry that my memory isn't more sharp than it was, but as I said, it was
No, this has been great
A
to
positive
get this edition, as I said, from someone who was a league member and then sort of part of that whole sort of civic community that the league works with, as well as an elected official. So I think it's really very interesting to have both perspectives in one person.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot for participating.